CDP Supply Chain Scope 3 Value Chain Emissions webinar. Bit of training, bit of discussion, bit of case study. So looking forward to it. We've got a great lineup for you today. I'm just going to share my screen. So if I could ask you, the first thing is if everybody could mute your speakers. And I'll just get the presentation up here. Excellent.
I was trying to say it in like a really nice way, without being like stop emailing the alien.
Okay, so we've got some people with their sound on. So Shay, if you could mute them over there, please.
Yeah, I have done.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks very much. So sorry, that's not the start. Apologies. There you are. I'm sharing all the slides with you in advance. Okay, here we go. So our agenda today is, firstly, my name is Brian O'Kennedy. I'm the Managing Director of Clearstream Solutions, and we're the admin support executive behind the CDP Ireland Network. And I'm going to give you a little update on why Scope 3 is important. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Grainne, who's going to take us through Scope 3 demystified. Obviously a challenging and complex, sometimes complex area. Grainne is going to unravel it for us. And then it's great pleasure that we have a CDP. We have Hugo Ernest-Jones from CDP Supply Chain with us, and he's going to talk to us about the CDP Supply Chain program. And then I guess possibly, if I can say that the highlight for me, certainly anyway, is a conversation with Ken O'Farrell from Microsoft and Dave Fitzgerald from Kellogg about what they're doing in their supply chains to address Scope 3 emissions. So interesting afternoon. Just as I said, a little bit of housekeeping. We're using Teams, so please, if you could mute your video. We'll have our videos on, but please mute your sound and your video. We will be taking questions via the Teams meeting chat. So you'll see there's a little chat button on Teams. So please, if you want to communicate with us, use that. Or you can email Shay at clearstreamsolutions.ie. We are recording the session, and slides will be available afterwards. So if you're having your coffee or your tea and your lunch and you miss something, don't worry, you'll get a chance to revise. So a lot of people ask us what's been happening since COVID as to whether the issue of climate has fallen off the agenda or has it accelerated or changed in any way. And all I can say is that there's actually been a significant increase in the focus. And talking to even Dave Fitzgerald this morning about his experience in terms of all of the activity going on in this space, there's actually been a heightened increase in focus on climate change since COVID. So whether it's that we're more conscious of what's happening in the planet, or whether it's that we have more time or we're just cramming more stuff in, whatever it is, in CDP here in Ireland ourselves, we've seen a huge increase in the number of companies reporting. This year, we've actually seen a 50% increase in the Irish corporate climate change disclosures. So far from this being something which is disappearing or is slipping down the priority list, we're actually seeing climate change become a much more significant issue for businesses and companies. It's not in any way to belittle the dreadful milestone that we hit with a million deaths, but from the longer term perspective, we have a very significant issue ahead. And that's, I guess, just to start with, and thank you for those who responded to the survey. And I would encourage you, if you didn't respond, please go in and respond. It'll take about 2 or 3 minutes, but it's very valuable insight, and we will share it with you after. But here's the feedback in terms of the number of companies that of you who have measured your emissions and to what extent you've measured your emissions. So a significant number of people haven't calculated any emissions at all, so over 25%. And between that and Scope 1 and 2 emissions, probably just under 50%. Quite a big number of you have started to calculate your Scope 3 emissions. And as I said, a relatively small percentage, probably less than 25%, have calculated 1, 2, 3, most of their 3, and all of other relevant emissions. So I think we're in for an interesting conversation today. It looks like it's a topic that a lot of people are struggling to grapple with. Just want to say thanks to the chair, Shane O'Reilly and Owen Fahy, our vice chair, these hardworking members of the CDP Ireland Steering Committee who give up their time free. Seeing the numbers of increasing responders this year has been a great source of I guess, satisfaction to us, because we've been putting in a lot of hard work over a long time to encourage as many companies to report as possible. We are participating in Climate Finance Week on the 4th of November, and we'll have a discussion on climate reporting at that session. The scores will be released in December, fingers crossed, and we expect to have our CDP Ireland report out in January of 2020. Those of you who are following all the blogs and LinkedIn posts about Climate Week in the US will have seen there's been some significant announcements and developments, and particularly around the alignment. I'm not going to dwell on this, but a couple of very significant announcements is where the corporate reporting dialogue has gone from being a dialogue now to being a commitment. And most of the significant organizations in the world who are engaged in framework reporting and disclosure have all come together to develop a common standard for reporting ESG and sustainability and climate factors. So that's great news for all of us. So let's see how quickly that develops. But as I said, we've gone from dialogue to a commitment. The other interesting, I guess, publication of note is the white paper from the World Economic Forum that was produced by the four big accounting firms, Deloitte, EY, KPMG, and PwC, on, again, alignment of common metrics and consistency and sustainable reporting. So very important developments in the space for us. So very briefly, I just want to give you a quick introduction to why Scope 3 and why we see it as being so important. And the first area is investors. I don't know, 3 to 4 years ago at our launch of our CDP report, we were very lucky to have this gentleman join us, Murray Burks. He's a senior ESG strategist at DWS. Very pleasant looking chap, but actually he's a deadly assassin. Murray's role is to go around poking in your supply chains to look for risk, climate risk specifically, and opportunity. But his job as a strategist is not, he sees all your nice reports and what people publish, but his job is to dig behind that and look into our supply chains and see whether there's climate risk. So the investor group have been very significantly focused on looking at this topic, and they're one of the big drivers in terms of the increased focus on Scope 3 emissions. Generally, we're seeing a reporting maturity. I mean, we talked about the extra 50% increase in companies reporting here. Companies are getting more comfortable with sustainability reporting and specifically measuring and reporting their carbon emissions. So adding additional Scope 3 items is becoming more common, and they're getting used to some of the areas of lack of certainty and how they might extrapolate. So Grainne is going to talk to us about that a little later, but we are seeing a growth in maturity there. A lot of the focus is driven by the corporate ambition that we're seeing in terms of science-based targets, in terms of net zero targets. So all of these targets require us to validate, verify, and to set emissions targets in our supply chain. So that's driving a lot of organizations to address the issues, not just within our own operational emissions, but our Scope 3 emissions. If we want to set a science-based target or be net zero sometime in the future, we have to focus and factor in Scope 3 emissions. TCFD, another initial task force on financial disclosure. This is trying to put financial measures on our climate risk. And it has a tremendous momentum in terms of organizations using this framework. It's also built into the CDP supply chains or into the CDP response program. So if you're doing CDP, you're addressing a lot of the issues in TCFD, but it's looking at risk and opportunity in our supply chains, right across our value chains. And finally, competition, and I will single out, I know we've got Microsoft on the call, but it was fascinating when they came up with their moonshot about being carbon, obviously carbon neutral, which they've been for some time, but net negative in terms of emissions by 2030. Within, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks, we saw Amazon and Google and others respond to that. So this is a good thing. I mean, we're seeing this organizations compete on their ability to provide lower carbon solutions for their customers. So there's just some perspectives on this, and it was interesting. We asked you similar questions as to where you saw the main importance or the areas of importance in Scope 3 in your organization. And the darker, the orange obviously the greater the response and focus. And the two top areas where most of our emissions are in our supply chain. So you recognize most of your emissions are in scope 3. Engaging with suppliers was another hot topic, and emissions reduction targets. So again, there's a number of other themes here around resilience and innovation and investor, which we'll come back to, but that certainly bears out what we were suggesting in terms of the main areas of focus. So why are scope 3 emissions important? Why are they so important? Well, as we said, it's the greatest impact. Most organizations have a minimum of 50 to 80% of their total emissions in their scope 3 items. And Grainne is going to talk to us a lot more detail. In some sectors, such as retail, it's well over 90%. There's a cost and competitive advantage here. If we go back to 15 years ago, Walmart were the first ones to start measuring carbon emissions in their supply chain. And why? They were looking to reduce and eliminate cost in their supply chain and to develop a competitive advantage. Climate risk I talked about with TCFD. The circular economy, again, most of us know that at least 50% of our emissions are embodied in the materials that we produce. So stuff that we buy. So the ability to keep products and materials alive and in circulation has a big impact on the carbon efficiency of the economy. Employees, brand impact. Our employees are the first ones to know if we're not being authentic about what we're doing in this space and to call BS on our activities. So companies that are leading in this space are doing so because of the impact it has on employee retention and obviously brand impact. Procurement, I like to call it the power of the PO. Having been on the receiving end of this for many, many years, the impact of a customer, a buyer telling us that within the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to go to net zero or whatever it is, and you guys are going to have to come with us if you want to do business with us. You buyers and procurement people in the audience don't realize the impact that you have by setting that kind of pathway out in your procurement strategies and the impact that that has on suppliers. So that sort of engagement between buyers and suppliers is critical to unlock and for us to be able to hit our climate strategies. And finally, innovation. And we've some great case studies here with Microsoft and Kellogg in terms of how these companies are driving innovation in their conversation with their suppliers through a focus on scope 3 emissions. Briefly, the challenges. We have disconnected systems. So in reality, our value chains are not that simple and not linear, and we have multi-tiers, and we have different suppliers with different issues or concerns, plus these 15 items that we're going to talk to you about in your scope 3 are all, in a lot of cases, very unrelated. So very challenging for us to put our arms around all of this. And very often the issue of ownership, whether these emissions are ours or third party, and the influence that we can have on reducing them is a key issue. We have siloed operations ourselves. Our designers may not know what happens at end of life. So bringing all of that visibility together into our organizations to be able to affect that supply chain change is difficult. Having tools and data and the ability to be able to understand what's happening across multi-tiers is a real challenge. And we're only getting good at the measurement models. Life cycle footprinting of products, which we do a lot of, is still a relatively new science. So a lot of the measurement models are still relatively new. So I'm delighted to say that we're going to try and, as we discussed, unravel some of these for you over the next approximately hour or so. And I'm now with great pleasure, going to hand over to my colleague, Grainne, who's going to take us through an overview of scope 3 emissions. Grainne.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so I'm going to do an overview of scope 3 emissions and hopefully demystify the scope 3 emissions in general for everyone. So I'm going to firstly talk about what is scope 3 emissions and how are they different from operational emissions. Then I'm going to go into measuring scope 3 emissions and how one might go about that. And then I'm going to end with the journey of scope 3 and how calculation of emissions in this category might evolve over time. So firstly, what is scope 3? So we have Ken from Microsoft here today, and I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear that we have a video from Microsoft we're going to play for you. So it'll just go through the basics of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and then I'll take it from there.
consensus is clear. The world has a
Skip it a bit forward.
huge carbon problem. Humans have released this blanket of carbon in our atmosphere. Scientists agree that
Okay, I'm just going to skip it to here from to show what's relevant.
that if we don't do anything, temperatures could rise somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. So what can we do? Well, it starts by understanding and getting real about carbon math. Scientists account for carbon emissions by classifying them into 3 categories or scopes. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that your activities create, like the exhaust from the car you drive. Or, for a business, the trucks it drives to transport its products from one place to another, or the diesel generators it might run. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that come from the production of the electricity or heat you use, like the traditional energy sources that light up your home or power the buildings owned by a business. Scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions that come from all the other activities in which you're engaged, including the emissions associated with producing the food you eat or manufacturing the products that you buy. For a business, these emissions The scientific consensus is clear. The world has a huge carbon problem. Humans have released more than 2 trillion metric tons.
Hopefully you got to see the basics of that video where it explained the difference between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Yeah, I'll go through it now anyway to reiterate. So scope 1 emissions is any direct emissions on site or from assets that you own. 2 emissions is any indirect emissions from the electricity that you purchase. And then scope 3 emissions is pretty much everything else. So any other indirect emissions from activities in your business. So what can be included in scope 3 emissions? So obviously your direct operations, that's going to be your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And then your scope 3 emissions can be upstream or downstream. So some things that could be included in your upstream scope 3 emissions. So business travel, very common. Employees may be going on air travel, maybe not this year, but typically, or claiming back mileage for travel in their own vehicles. Upstream transportation and distribution. So this is any transportation that's coming inbound. Emissions from waste. So for the waste generated within your operations, firstly, what is the waste that's being generated, and then where is it going? So is it going to landfill? Is it being recycled? And what are the emissions associated with those processes? And then upstream water emissions. So this is emissions associated with the processing of water before it reaches the organization. So making sure it's potable water or up to a high enough standard for your for commercial use. Employee commuting. So if you have 5,000 staff in your business who are coming to and from the office every day, what's the emissions impact of that? Is it private car use they're using? Are they using zero emissions vehicles, bikes, etc.? And what is the emissions impact of that? So purchase goods and services. So if you're an office buying a box of pens, what's the emissions associated with manufacturing that pen and getting it to the gate of your organization? Capital goods, so same again here. So what's the emissions associated with manufacturing that capital good and bringing it to the gate of your organization? Other fuel and energy related activities. So this is the hidden emissions associated with fuel and energy. So typically in Scope 1, Scope 2, you'll measure the emissions associated directly from fuel and energy. So for example, let's say you're measuring emissions from the diesel in a vehicle. In Scope 1, Scope 2, you'll measure the emissions associated directly with combusting that diesel within the vehicle. Scope 3 emissions, you may calculate the well-to-tank emissions of that diesel. So what are the emissions associated with extracting that diesel and bringing it up until the point where it reaches your vehicle, all those kind of upstream emissions. And then similarly with electricity, for every kilowatt hour of electricity you consume, there's going to be a small piece of electricity that's lost to transmission and distribution losses. So what's the emissions associated with generating that energy, which is just lost? And then leased assets. So if your organization rents out any vehicles or any other assets, what's the emissions associated with operating those? Okay, so then downstream emissions in Scope 3. So transportation and distribution. So this is any outbound transportation and distribution. Downstream water emissions. So this is emissions associated with processing wastewater and the emissions associated with that. So processing of sold materials. So say, for example, you're an organization who sells raw materials onto another manufacturer and will then manufacture that material into another product. What's the emissions associated with them processing the materials that you've sold to them? Use of sold products. So say, for example, you're an organization who sells laptops. What's the emissions associated with the electricity needed to run that laptop for its lifespan, say 5 years or so? And then end of life treatment of that sold product. So at the end of that laptop's lifespan, where is it going to end up? Is it ending up in landfill? Is it being recycled? And what are the emissions associated with that? Leased assets. So downstream leased assets is if you're an organization that rents out assets to other people, and what are their emissions associated with using your assets? Franchises, so the operational emissions, say, for example, McDonald's of all the franchises. And then investment, downstream Scope 3 emissions. So particular interest for maybe financial services. What's the carbon impact of the investment? Is it a fossil fuel dependent investment or otherwise? Okay, so we asked you in the survey to give an idea of either what is or what you would expect your Scope 3 emissions to be as a percentage of your overall footprint. The majority of people said 50 to 75% of their emissions they would expect to be Scope 3, which is quite high, but it's quite typical of what we would normally see. And then a large part of you said that you were unsure what percentage your Scope 3 emissions would be, which is also not very uncommon considering how large scoping, what a broad scope Scope 3 emissions can have, and how difficult it is sometimes to pinpoint it. So just to show as an example, as we saw in the, well, you may not have seen in the video, I'm not sure if you could see it correctly, but because Scope 3 has such a large scope and so many categories can be included in it, oftentimes it will be the largest emission source for a lot of organizations. And this will change depending on what sector you're in and the nature of your business. Obviously, if you're an electricity generator, your Scope 1 emissions are going to be way higher than your Scope 3. But on average, I think it's about a 5-to-1 ratio of Scope 3 emissions to Scope 1 and 2 emissions for an organization. And this is just an example from Puka Tea. So they did a carbon footprint with all Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. And you can see if you look at it, that the emissions from their offices and warehouse is actually a very small percentage of their overall footprint. It's only about 3% of the emissions. Where the rest of their emissions lie is growing, processing the tea, the transportation and distribution of the tea, the end of life of the tea. And then if you look at that large purple chunk there, almost half of their emissions are attributed to use of the product. So the electricity associated with someone boiling the kettle to make a cup of Puka tea. I'm sure this is a good example to show not only how large Scope 3 emissions can be in an organization, but also the category that you think maybe is most emission intensive in Scope 3. It maybe another category is larger than you think. I'm sure when they went to go do this, they didn't think that use of the product would be the largest emission source for them. So how do you measure Scope 3? So we asked everyone what was the main challenges faced by your organisation in calculating Scope 3 emissions. The top answer that came out was that it's very difficult to gather data. And that's a common problem we hear, obviously, because Scope 3 is outside of your direct control. And then we also see some people say they just don't know where to start or they don't know how to calculate emissions. So before I get into how to actually calculate emissions, I'm going to talk a little bit about data collection, just because that seems to be the largest barrier for a lot of people. So ideally, when you are calculating emissions, in an ideal world, you'll get primary data, which is basically as direct data as you can. So if you're trying to calculate emissions from diesel combustion in a vehicle, primary data would be how many litres of diesel exactly was used in that vehicle. And that's in an ideal world. Obviously, because Scope 3 oftentimes is outside of the direct control of an organisation, you will have to rely on secondary data when calculating emissions from this source. And there's different levels of secondary data, so you can go as estimated or as close to primary data as you can. And typically over time, people will try to improve their data collection to get it as close to primary data as they can. So let's say, for example, if you can't get litres of diesel consumed in the vehicle, maybe you know the distance that the vehicle's travelled, or you can't get that, maybe another step away is you can estimate the distance based on the typical routes that those vehicles take and on average how often they do those routes. Maybe you don't have that, but you can maybe do a broad extrapolation based on spend data with those vehicles. And then maybe worst case scenario, well, not worst case scenario, but maybe the most kind of secondary data you can do is just a very top level estimation just based on the number of vehicles you have and typical activity expected in your sector for those vehicles. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about now how to actually quantify emissions once you've actually gathered data. So the most common way to calculate emissions is to use emission factors. So emission factors will relate a carbon number to your activity data. So if you collect data in litres, tonnes, kilometres, emission factors will be based on databases, research or something of that sort, and will relate a carbon number of, so tonnes of carbon per litre per kilometre for whatever you've collected. Supplier specific data. So this is probably one of the best ways you can calculate emissions from Scope 3. So obviously, if it's not in your direct control, the best way to quantify emissions from that is to get direct information from whoever is in control of those emissions. So you can do this by engaging with suppliers, or I'm sure Hugo will talk once he's on about the CDP supply chain program, where you can actually ask your suppliers for emissions, for their emissions. Direct monitoring is another way to calculate emissions. So this is maybe not so common in Scope 3 where things aren't directly within your control. This is a way to calculate emissions and directly monitor, maybe for example, directly monitoring fuel consumption within a vehicle and calculating it as you go. So environmentally standard input-output models. So these are very generalized tools and they will basically relate spend data to emissions data, but they will do it in a very broad sense, maybe with a national inventory or maybe average of a global sector or global industry. They're not very nuanced and they're very hard to show improvements over time because they don't really allow for that kind of subtlety, but they can be a good way for people to get started calculating a particular Scope 3 category which they find trouble calculating. And then the last one is life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment. So this is basically a carbon footprint of a product. And I'll show you here. So it's calculating the emissions from extracting raw materials of the product, manufacturing, packaging, distribution, the use of the product and disposal. So all the emissions encompassed over the lifespan of the product from cradle to grave. And here's this example. It's another Microsoft example. But it's an LCA they've done on their Surface Pro 7, and they're able to look at this and say, okay, majority of our emissions lie in manufacturing and use of the product, and then we have a little bit in transport and a tiny piece in disposal, and they're able to come out with a carbon number then for their product. So I'm going to talk a bit about the journey of Scope 3 and how this might evolve over time. So if you're an organisation that hasn't started to calculate Scope 3 emissions yet, or doesn't know where to start, or is just starting to get on that journey, it's worth taking time to take a step back and evaluate your scope 3 emissions. So firstly, what scope 3 categories are relevant to your organisation? And it's no harm also to have that list out of all of the categories, because oftentimes companies will be able to name off maybe 3 or 4 of the big ones or the obvious ones, but they might miss out other ones which are actually quite a large piece of their scope 3, which they just haven't considered. Say, for example, Puka tea. It's very easy to forget the use of the product, but it turns out being half of their emissions overall. Once you've identified what scope 3 categories are relevant to you, what would you expect to be the most emission intensive of those categories? Just intuitively, but also it's no harm to maybe look and see at others in your field who have already calculated emissions and what are their emission breakdowns and what is coming out the highest for them. Typically speaking, if you're starting your scope 3 journey right now, there's been someone in your field who's probably been calculating emissions for 10 years, and hopefully they'll have published that maybe in a sustainability report or the website, or if they report to CDP. CDP is obviously a disclosure platform for your emissions. So if they've done a public response, you'll be able to go in and view their emissions on that if you know some of the big names in your field. So don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is a very good quote to keep in mind when you're doing scope 3. So chances are when you calculate scope 3 emissions for the first time, you're not going to have every single relevant category in your scope 3 calculated for year 1. Some of the categories are not going to be perfect. You're maybe just getting a ballpark figure for some of them. And that's completely fine. Most companies will evolve and improve and add more scopes to their scope 3 journey over time and improve their data collection and improve their quantification methods. So here is just an example of a graph we've done out for a clothes retailer and the scope 3 categories that are relevant to them. So obviously it's not all 15 categories, it's only some of them. And you'll see here on the vertical axis that the higher up you go, the more of an impact that scope 3 category has on their emissions. And then the more horizontal you go, the more difficult it is to actually collect data for that emission source and to quantify emissions from it. So if you look at the bottom corner there, you'll see waste and water. So relatively easy to collect data from that and to quantify emissions. You can just get it from a waste service provider or a water service provider. But you can see an emissions impact, it's quite a low impact in terms of emissions. It tends to be quite a small percentage of companies' overall emissions. In the top corner then, you can see as an outlier in the top right, you'll see purchase goods and services. So purchase goods and services for a retailer, if you think of every single good that's coming in through those doors, incredibly difficult to collect all of that data to quantify emissions for every single good. But that's probably where over 90% of emissions for a retailer will be. So you can see that it's very difficult to get data on, but very high impact. So it's something to always keep in mind as you go along your scope 3 journey, that if you know that it's in a high emissions impact too, you're maybe not going to have a first year around, you're maybe not going to have a perfect couple years down the line, but it's always to try be in quantifying emissions from that and improving it over time. So we have a graph here, we have a response for the survey here, which is just where we asked you what scope 3 categories you actually currently calculate. And this is kind of typical of what we would see, just with the top ones. So waste, water, business travel, and then transport and distribution. So they're the ones that are typically easiest to get data on and to quantify emissions from. So they're ones that a lot of companies will start out on when they are quantifying scope 3 emissions. And this is, I won't go through this, but this is just an example of a journey for someone with their scope 3 emissions. Maybe year 1, they have wastewater, bit of distribution. Year 2, they've improved their distribution emissions data. They'll start doing estimations on extraction. Year 3, they've improved their extraction data. They'll start getting data on usage and estimation, and so on and so forth. So I'll leave you with this. So we're going to share the slides afterwards so you'll have this, but this is just some useful resources. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Value Chain Standard is kind of the de facto standard on scope 3 emissions. So would encourage you to start there if you're starting on your journey. CDP obviously has their supply chain program. They have webinars on site. Clearstream Solutions obviously is here to help. If you're an SME, Enterprise Ireland has funding and assistance available through their Green Start program. And then life cycle assessment databases, I have a few listed there. So that is all from me. I'm going to hand over to Hugo now, who is the supply chain lead in CDP, and he will leave you in safe hands.
Thanks so much, Grainne. Is the sound working okay?
Yeah.
Hope so. Okay. Fantastic. Great. Great. Many thanks for that fantastic kind of context behind Scope 3, Grainne, and delighted to be joining you today to represent the CDP supply chain team and to be speaking alongside two of our esteemed supply chain members, Kellogg and Microsoft. So delighted to be joining Ken and Dave as well on this conversation. Just to introduce myself, my name's Hugo and I work in the supply chain team based in Berlin and lead our work engaging with European multinationals to engage their suppliers on climate change, water and deforestation impacts and to track and measure impacts and action plans towards reducing those risks and material risks in the supply chains that they have. So we are kind of the sort of theory of change essentially behind what we do in the CDP supply chain program is based on the idea that by asking suppliers to disclose on their environmental impacts, their risks and opportunities as well, this actually encourages suppliers to start taking action to address those risks. Furthermore, by collecting this data on behalf of the purchasing organizations that they're working with, we're enabling those purchasing organizations to integrate environmental data into the heart of their business decisions around procurement. So I know you're probably all very familiar with CDP and what we do. So my focus is going to be particularly on this, the scope 3 category 1 emissions aspect of the data collection that we work on through the supply chain program. And I'd like also to draw out some of the kind of trends that we're seeing, some of which have been highlighted already by Brian and Grainne in terms of what's driving this increased focus on scope 3 category 1 emissions. As well as how this all ties into the topic of science-based targets, which of course is a key driver of the reasons why companies are more interested in scope 3 at the moment. So just to give you a kind of overview of the supply chain program, these are the organizations that we currently work with. We have over 155 members globally. And through their request for information, we have over 8,000 suppliers responding through the CDP supply chain program. So the request for this information from purchasing organizations is really driving a lot of the disclosure that we see through the CDP platform itself. And I think what's interesting about this is that, of course, global corporations and public sector buyers have supply chains that wrap around the globe. And therefore, there's this huge potential for them to be driving climate action at scale, using their procurement spend as a leverage tool to influence and collaborate with their key suppliers in their global supply chains, and also incentivize behavior shifts towards more sustainable ways of operating that we want to see in order to meet our net zero goals. And we see awareness of this potential definitely increasing. This year we had a 24% increase in the number of companies working with us to engage their suppliers on these topics, with new members like Nike, Airbus, Sainsbury's and Ørsted joining us this year. So if we move to the next slide, just to kind of build on a couple of the points that Brian had mentioned earlier about why companies are taking action on scope 3 and particularly on the supply chain side. While many companies have a handle on how they're managing their operational impacts, and I think this also came out in the survey data that we saw earlier, we're seeing this emerging best practice for corporations to take responsibility of their whole value chain's environmental impacts. And this is quickly becoming a market expectation and also an expectation of investors as well. From the data that we've collected over the last 10 years of running the supply chain program, we found that on average, emissions in the supply chain are 5.5 times higher than the company's direct operational emissions. And this varies quite a bit from sector to sector, with some sectors such as retail being much higher than that. But essentially what this kind of tells us is that the buyer-supplier dynamic can really make or break whether our economy reaches net zero by 2050, as the scientific community says we need to. So science-based targets really are driving a lot of this uptake, and science-based targets themselves are becoming a badge of leadership as well, again, as an expectation for companies to start setting these targets themselves. And in order to set a science-based target, companies will need to look at the scope 3 emissions of their entire value chain, and often set a target that focuses as well in part on their supply chain emissions. So we work with a number of organizations to help collect this data on the scope 3 category 1 emissions of their value chain, and to track and engage suppliers to take action on those. We've also found from the data that we've collected that companies are identifying significant cost savings from the emission reductions initiatives that they're implementing. So suppliers last year reported over $20 billion US dollars in cost savings from the emission reduction initiatives that they're implementing. Depending on the level of maturity of certain suppliers, there may be a lot of quick wins that they can start to implement to reduce costs and their emissions, such as making equipment and lighting upgrades, which of course reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also their customers' scope 3 emissions. And if we move on to the next slide, I wanted to just mention a point about the importance of renewable energy and the potential for cascading renewable energy use, again, throughout the supply chain. In our last report, we found that a gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions could be cut if disclosing suppliers increase the proportion of renewable energy that they procure by 20%. So this is a really huge area of potential, equal to the emissions of Brazil and Mexico combined. So purchasing organizations can kind of encourage and incentivize these shifts towards renewable energy use throughout their supplier base, having at scale a really significant impact. And this is a trend we also see among the supply chain members with whom we work. We have 31 members who are actively incentivizing and engaging their suppliers to switch to renewable energy, which obviously in turn reduces their own scope 3 emissions. If we move on to the next slide, I wanted to just touch on the topic of risk as well as another sort of reason and motivation we see for companies engaging with their suppliers. So in 2019, the suppliers that responded to CDP reported over $1 trillion in environmental impacts related to climate change, posed by issues such as physical impacts, increased regulation or taxation, and changing market demands and trends, which of course has huge impacts for them as suppliers, but also for their customers as well. So understanding these types of risks in supply chains and the types of actions that suppliers are taking to mitigate these risks helps to build resilience into the supply chain, and also identify areas where the customer itself can actually intervene to help support those suppliers to enhance their environmental performance and therefore the resilience. And of course, the flip side of these risks and this exposure is, of course, the great potential there for reducing emissions. So, of course, this sort of shift towards renewable energy, again, is a huge opportunity. Currently, the reliance on fossil fuels is, of course, a risk to a lot of companies and a lot of the customers with whom they work. But again, by shifting to renewables, there's that opportunity to reduce that risk and the carbon emissions associated with the way those suppliers are operating. So turning now to the next slide, I wanted also to touch on the topic of science-based targets and to kind of put these into context with regard to scope 3 emissions. So essentially the big picture is that climate science shows that the entire global economy must halve their emissions by 2030. And so this decade really needs to be a super decade of ambitious climate action. And the science-based targets framework provides a set of criteria for companies to set their ambition in line with these scientific demands. And in order to achieve a climate safe future, all companies need to be pursuing a science-based target. We've seen a lot of uptake in science-based targets recently, with 991 companies having committed to setting a science-based target, and of those, 472 having already set targets that have been verified by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We also have we're part of a very important campaign called the Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign, which is an urgent call to action for companies to set emission reduction targets in line with a 1.5 degree future. And this is backed by UN leaders and business organizations and NGOs. And currently we have 294 companies that have signed up to this ambition. If we move on to the next slide, you can see here a bit more information about how Scope 3 emissions relate to this the science-based target framework. So essentially, all science-based targets need to include Scope 3 emissions if they account for over 40% of an organization's total emissions, which is often the case. And then companies need to set emissions reduction targets that collectively cover at least 2/3 of those Scope 3 emissions. The science-based target framework has a sort of degree of flexibility over Scope 3 target setting, given that it is a kind of complex area. But these are the kind of minimum requirements in order to set an SBT and the requirements from a Scope 3 perspective. And for many companies, the majority of their Scope 3 emissions will be concentrated in the supply chain, and within that supply chain on a number of kind of priority suppliers where a lot of their spend is actually going to. And therefore, in order to be able to identify those suppliers and to create a powerful and effective supply chain engagement strategy, it's very helpful to get access to primary data from those suppliers. So to actually know kind of the direct data from your suppliers in terms of their emissions enables you to kind of prioritize which suppliers you need to engage with in order to reduce your own Scope 3 impacts and to align with your science-based target. So you can start to use this to sort of build out different types of scenarios. So for example, by collecting this primary data, you can start to see, okay, if this group of suppliers reduce their emissions by a certain amount, then my value chain will be aligned with a 1.5 degree future or a well below 2 degree future. If these key suppliers that I work with don't manage to meet these reductions, then I'm going to be off track for my science-based target. Therefore, I can use this information to engage with those suppliers directly and suggest ways that they can help, that they can reduce their emissions. So this is a lot of the work that we've been doing recently with our members, is to kind of develop these sort of strategies to help them really focus in their engagement with their suppliers in order to meet their SBTs. One other thing that's quite interesting when it comes to science-based targets is that companies can also choose to set what's called an engagement target, where essentially they require their suppliers themselves to set a science-based target rather than an absolute emissions reduction goal or an intensity goal. So this is quite an interesting exercise and something that we see a lot of uptake from as well among the companies that we work with. So when you're looking at suppliers and encouraging them to set a science-based target themselves, by collecting primary data on their current status, their current environmental strategy, and their current targets, you can start to see the likelihood of those suppliers actually setting a science-based target in the future and enabling you to meet your minimum criteria for your SBT. And so this is again another kind of trend we're seeing towards this engagement target type of goal. And through the collection of primary data, it can help to assess the likelihood of those suppliers getting on track to help you meet that component of the SBT. So if we jump to the slide 8, sorry, previous one. I think we may already have been there. Thank you. So just to kind of summarize, essentially, really companies' engagement with their supply chains can really make or break whether the economy itself can reach a net zero goal by 2050, as the science dictates. And this exercise of engaging and collecting primary data allows you to get very specific about the gaps in terms of your supplier's readiness to align with science-based demands for a sustainable future, and enables you to then target your engagement with them accordingly. Alongside this, it also is useful to help identify some of these risks that I mentioned earlier, and to look for ways in which you can collaborate with suppliers to reduce their exposure to climate, water and deforestation risks. So I'll leave it there and hand back over to you, Grainne and Brian. Thanks very much.
Hugo, thank you very much. That was really excellent, and hopefully lots of interesting examples there of how we can use the CDP program to both collect data, motivate suppliers, and actually not a bad place to start off, Hugo, because it was just, before as we kind of get ourselves organized here, just to ask you about, we have a lot of companies still not disclosing and measuring and, start early on the journey. So any thoughts or advice for companies looking to start out in terms of their emissions reporting and disclosure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really great question. I think the classic things that we'd often encourage companies to think about when they're starting their disclosure is really to focus on scope 1 and 2 emissions, and to report that in an accurate way. Ideally, over time, to get those emissions verified as well, in order to ensure the sort of quality and integrity of the data that's being disclosed and also shared with customers. So scope 1 and 2, from a kind of initial disclosure point of view, I think is very important for the supply chain members that we're working with, and is often a very kind of focus for them. Alongside that, we see a lot of the supply chain members, again, that we work with, focusing on the targets that their suppliers are setting. So as a company, again, that's getting started on this process, setting a goal in terms of your emission reduction ambitions that you can communicate to customers, again, is also a very kind of powerful indication of your ambition as a company, essentially. And then the third component I'd also emphasize is to implement some kind of emission reduction initiative, whether that is the switch to renewable energy, perhaps some occupancy sensors, switching to LED lighting, some simple things to get started with in terms of reducing your energy use. And then again, disclosing that through CDP. So those three things, the reporting of scope 1 and 2, setting a target, and then communicating some kind of initiatives that are helping to get towards those targets.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I know a lot of people are somewhat nervous or afraid about the whole process, and they want to have everything perfect. I love Grainne's quote about not letting perfection be the enemy of progress, in terms of really the value is starting out. So whether it's starting to measure your emissions or starting to report them, get on the journey, get working on it. I have a question for Grainne on that, because like we get the purists telling us, oh, you need to focus on the material issues. So there's no point in ignoring, focusing on items that are not that critical, maybe employee commute or something like that, which isn't the big factor. You should be focusing on the big things. But very often we see companies starting and getting comfortable. I mean, what's your thought on that, Grainne? Should we just get comfortable with some stuff that we might have data on, or should we be trying to hit the big stuff? Or what do you see by way of a journey for companies?
I would say to start off with what you're comfortable with, but if you know something is a big emission source for you, but it's very difficult for you to tackle at the start. To maybe have a plan in the future to start to tackle that. Maybe you don't have it in your first year, you're just getting yourself comfortable with maybe say wastewater or something like that. But you can build yourself towards it in the future, even if the first time you calculate it, it's very secondary data. It's really just a ballpark figure. It's not really something you're comfortable disclosing outwardly, just so you have an understanding the magnitude of that emission source and how material it might be for you. And then you can improve that as you go along.
Perfect. Okay, really, really good. And we do see that. We see publicly a lot of companies making that commitment to address operational emissions initially, and then to, over time, it's absolutely valid to start addressing additional issues, items of scope 3 emissions. So now I'd like to invite our two other panelists to join us, and that's Ken O'Farrell from Microsoft and David Fitzgerald from Kellogg. And I think we can see Ken on screen there. Hopefully you can hear us okay, Ken. I'm going to ask the rest of you, please, for the moment, if you can, to stay on mute. while we get the perspectives of Ken and David. If you have questions, Shay will be collecting them in the chat box. So please fire ahead, post your questions in there. We'll do our best to pick them up and to ask them to you. So we have, I guess we'll start with you, Ken, maybe just to give us a quick insight. So Microsoft, you know, phenomenal ambition that you've announced, and I spoke about the competition. What's this getting all of these organizations competing with each other as to who's going to be the most sustainable and reduce the carbons. And I guess that sort of moonshot announcement that we saw from you some months back, I'd love to hear about that and you know, how the ambition is filtering down to your part of the operation, which is freight and logistics.
Sure, thanks, Brian. I think absolutely Microsoft came up with this big, bold initiative. I think we were spinning a little bit on sustainability, and then Satya Nadella came back, who's our CEO, and basically there are two bold initiatives. One, by 2030, that we would be carbon negative, and that's scope 1, 2, and 3, and 2, by 2050. We would reverse any carbon emissions since we started the company in 1975. So if you think of those, they're quite. The first one is quite an aggressive target, and the second one then is like really just, you know, we'd have had no impact ever since we came in. So they're quite bold initiatives, and it comes from I suppose, the culture of the org under Satya has changed dramatically over the last number of years, and really it's about innovation, collaboration, growth mindset, diversity, inclusiveness. How do you bring all that to the table? And then he applied those principles again into, well, how do we set a leading edge sustainability? We don't want to look at anybody, we don't want to copy anybody, we just want to do the right thing and see how you could do that. So I think by creating such a bold corporate vision, what it's done for us, it's liberated the thinking a bit in Microsoft internally. So now all the business groups who manage all the products like Surface or Xbox or some of the other business like Azure, that concentrates the mind. On top of that, we have internal charges, so we charge $15 per CO2 ton admitted by each of the businesses. So it focuses the mind, but really, what I think the idea of the bold initiative, it liberates and it allows you to be, you have to be more innovative. You have to get your house in order to tackle something like that. If you don't, you really you're never going to hit that target. And that's really what it does. Instead of feeling huge pressure, it's actually quite liberating.
Interesting. So and how does it trickle down to you, Ken, in terms of, you got the vision strategically, in terms of your involvement, you're dealing with suppliers. What kind of things are you doing practically?
So I think what it does is it does a couple of things. So shoots about a shot across the bow of all our suppliers that this is something that's been taken seriously, and it's something that Microsoft has signed up. So straight away, your supplier and your base know that this question is coming, and then they're going to try and step up to the bar as well. But for us, if I just take the fulfillment and logistics network, so if you think about it, we have a lot of manufacturing in Southeast Asia. It comes into the various distribution centers we have around the world, and then they're fulfilled to various channels like B2C, enterprise, retail, disty, the traditional channels. And then what we've been doing is that we've what we call a cloud-based supply chain, so based off Azure. And what we've done is we have implemented a TMS, a transport management system. So it calculates distance, it calculates all our movements, it tells us what mode is traveled by, oceans, air, truck, whatever it is, and how it gets to the channel. And what we've been doing is we've overlaid the GLEC measurement, so the Global Logistics Emissions Council. So that framework and those calculations, we got GLEC to validate it. And basically, we have built a CO2 emissions tool effectively. So it allows us to calculate. So the first and important thing is, before we could have a conversation with anybody, you have to be able to say, here's where I'm at. And that's been the fundamental difference. So now we can say where we're at. Now we can, and it kind of talks a little bit what Hugo talked about there. Once you know where you are, and you know what your target is, then you can start setting out some policy changes internally in Microsoft, whether we go by sea rather than by air, some business framework changes that we've had to do, and then you sit down with your suppliers, and you know what we're seeing in our quarterly business reviews with all our major carriers. They're having to come in and articulate their sustainability mission. They're getting involved. We're having collaborative type sustainability projects where we're bringing them in, and they're sitting with other carriers, and we're saying, this is what we want. What are you doing? And it just engenders more and more participation, and then you start getting a few successes on the back of that, and then it starts lifting from there. So we're very clear in what we're doing, and we're very clear in our measurements and where we're going, and then we start stitching all the projects together to enable that to happen.
I'd like to come back to you on that after, about that incentivize the suppliers versus, let's say, gentle encouragement. But before you do, I'd like to bring Dave Fitzgerald in. So Dave from Kellogg, obviously, Dave, you're very visible. You're on our breakfast table every morning. You know, as an organization, we can see there must be vast amounts of activity in the supply chain, and from farming right through. So what does this mean to Kellogg, first of all, in terms of strategically, what kind of ambition is there? You know, how are you, and how are you focusing on your Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, it's really interesting just listening to Hugo and to Ken, and there's a lot of parallels, I think, in terms of, you know, how we're approaching it. So we in Kellogg, we have a science-based target. We agreed back in 2015. So within that, we're obviously focusing on Scope 1 and 2, but we have a Scope 3 target as well. And I suppose the first thing you need to do, as Ken says, is you need to measure. You need to know where your emissions are, because if you want to develop a strategy, you need to know where you're going to focus your resources to get the biggest impact. And I suppose as part of that journey, we've been working with CDP and CDP supply chain to gather that information and engage our suppliers. So we've been involved in that for about the last 3 years now with CDP. Last year, I think we engaged about 400 suppliers through CDP supply chain globally. This year, we've reduced the number a little bit because we've become a little bit more focused and a little bit more purposeful about, you know, which suppliers we would include in that journey. And it has been a challenge, you know, getting suppliers on board. It's quite daunting in terms of, you know, making a submission to CDP. A lot of suppliers in our supply chain would be, you know, from an agricultural base. They wouldn't have a lot of resources dedicated to sustainability, measuring carbon emissions. Some of them, you know, haven't really thought about it in the past. So even just getting them on board, getting them thinking about it, has taken quite a lot of time and effort. So the way we do it now is we focus it based on a spend threshold. So we look at our top 80% of our spend, and we have a large tail of smaller spend suppliers that we don't necessarily involve in this process unless they're in a sector which has a risk of, you know, higher carbon emissions relative to others. And we exclude some segments, some categories within our procurement in terms of, you know, sectors that we know won't have a big impact on our supply chain. So overall, we're still in the process, I would say, of gathering that information and data. We know that it was interesting looking at the ratio as well that Hugo put up. Our Scope 3 to Scope 1 is about 6 to 1, which is pretty much exactly where you know, the food and beverage sector would be. So we have a big job to do, and a big chunk of that is agricultural emissions, and there are no easy solutions for agricultural emissions, and so we got to work with that sector in particular. And within that sector, you know, as a plant-based company with rice suppliers, rice is one of the bigger offenders when it comes to carbon emissions within the agricultural side of things. So, you know, again, it's about knowing where the emissions are and then basing your strategy on, you know, and where you focus your resources to reduce your emissions.
And can I ask you about that data side? Obviously, you're using data from CDP, are you collecting data from suppliers? You have a much more diversified, broad supply chain, I guess. How are you managing that data challenge?
Yeah, it's still a challenge in certain ways. Our focus initially has been on tier one suppliers, engaging them. As I said, some of them in the logistics sector would be a good example where they are a little bit further down the line in terms of how they measure their emissions. There's some legislation and guidelines in Europe for logistics companies around reporting and recording of emissions. So they tend to be a little bit more, let's say, developed in this area. If you look at some of the agricultural suppliers, the data quality is not so good, so you're talking about, as I said, emissions from rice growing, from the processing of rice. The processors will have their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, but they probably won't have that upstream agricultural data. So we're working with organizations, for example, like the Cool Farm Alliance, who have a tool called the Cool Farm tool. So we use that tool with our suppliers to estimate emissions in our supply chain at the farm level. We're investing in a little bit of academic research around developing those tools as well to give us better quality data, because at the moment it's probably based on quite generic emission factors, sometimes based on spend even rather than commodity. Commodity-based emission factors. So it's the quality can vary depending on the particular category you're looking at, and we're working to improve that as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think Grainne spoke to that in her presentation about, there isn't a one fits all. This is not going to be all one pipe that collects all the data. You will always have some element of other type of extrapolation or average. Yeah, just I'm fascinated, and maybe I'll start with Hugo on this one around the carrot or stick, particularly in this space, because we're dealing with suppliers. There's commercial issues here. So, are we favoring, and I believe at one of our supply chain events, we had one of the supply chain teams say that they'd set a bar that all their suppliers had to be all their key suppliers had to be a B- or better on their CDP supply chain. And I've seen that in a number of sustainability reports recently, where companies are actually specifying that stick that they're putting out there. Get up there and hit that target, or you're going to be taken off the list, versus they bring them all along and teach them and help. And so where does CDP would see a lot of this, Hugo? What sort of activity, where do you lie on the carrot or stick?
Yeah, really interesting question, and I think you see sort of different strategies in terms of the companies that we work with. But generally, I think the important thing to emphasize is this is a kind of shared responsibility. I think more companies are starting to look at the engagement with supply chains and even consumers as well as being a kind of a shared responsibility. So the kind of the carrot, I guess, when you're looking at it from a supply chain point of view, is that the suppliers that operate in a more sustainable way may find themselves in a more favorable position when it comes to actually deepening their relationship with the companies that they're working with, that are interested in their sustainability performance. And so, as you say, we see the CDP score or certain KPIs increasingly integrated into kind of procurement scorecards, for example, and looked at during annual meetings with suppliers to kind of assess their environmental performance alongside a load of other critical kind of procurement KPIs. And I think you can look at that as carrot or stick. It's either, but by performing well, there's that incentive that you'll potentially get more business from that organization. By performing less strongly on environmental aspects, potentially that could compromise your ability to work with that organization. But generally, I think it's important for companies to look to ways in which they can help to support the suppliers in their journey towards environmental leadership. We see some great examples there of companies, including those on the panel today, that leverage their own internal expertise to help their suppliers improve their performance, identify ways that they can reduce their energy use, for example. And I think that's great, because it kind of deepens the relationship between those companies and their suppliers as well.
Very interesting. And I've got to ask Ken, because I've been fascinated watching the big bad Microsoft turn into this, fluffy leadership organization that's out there. Just, I don't know whether that's Satya or whatever that's driving that, but are you doing that with your suppliers? Are you putting your arms around everyone, or are you still kicking them a little?
No, I think like you have to set a standard. So there's no mistaking that, right? And then you have a choice if you want to like to be a strategic partner with Microsoft, and there's benefits that come with that. Then I think you open up that, and you kind of get them to buy into the Microsoft philosophy. So it's not just like sustainability; is that we're looking at a lot of our supplier base to be working with us in terms of sharing our cultural values, and then in there, then obviously sustainability is a huge part of what we're trying to do. So you're trying to set a bar, and then saying, okay, now come work with us, and we will work with you, and then you're going to get like Hugo made a point there. It is a shared responsibility. And the reason it's a shared responsibility is it affects everybody. So everybody from the end consumer to the enterprise customer to the retailer, like ultimately the customer is going to demand this, it's going to drive this. So if you're disconnected from your customer base and customer wants, like you're not going to be leading anything for a long time, whether you're a Microsoft or whether you're one of our suppliers. So there's a collective will to do this because it's the right thing to do, and it's what your customer base are demanding going forward. So
Yeah.
so strategically, if you work with your supplier, you'll get further. So I'll give you an example, Brian. So we have our largest distribution center is in Europe, so we ship everything out from there. And like 12 months ago, we sat down with our partner Arvado to try and figure out how do we tackle this differently, and then how would you do it in a carbon neutral way. So what we've worked with them over the last 12 months is, and this is the beauty of working together, because then you get innovated. So we've worked with SunPower, who are the solar power company. We've worked with the landlord who owns the building. It's a 450,000 square foot facility. We've worked with Arvado and ourselves. And now what we're doing is we've created a model where we're getting some funding from the Dutch government. The SunPower are making an ROIC, and both Arvado and ourselves are getting the whole place retrofitted out, and it's not costing anybody anything. And that's the collective will of doing it. And what we're going to get by December of this year, we'll have a carbon neutral distribution center. So it's never happened before for us. So it's a big deal for us. But if you work collectively, every party wins.
Well, that is a super case study. I love the collaboration, the innovation, the cost benefit. There's lots of win-wins there. Dave, Kellogg's, your approach to suppliers, I mean, you must have some that are not doing anything and that need a push, or how are you engaging that carrot or stick policy?
Yeah, it's, I mean, sorry, I turned on mute there for a second. A little bit like Ken said, it's, you're setting a standard, you're setting an expectation, and you're being set a standard as well. I mean, Kellogg as a business, we're being challenged by our customers, the retailers, and they're being challenged by consumers to do more about this stuff. So ultimately, as Ken said, it's coming all the way through the value chain. So, a standard is being set, we're talking about science-based targets, net zero, these are the buzzwords that are out there, everyone's hearing them. Businesses are setting this standard and saying, this is what we want to achieve. Now let's work with our suppliers. So there is a piece around getting them on board. And sometimes it does take some persuasion. Where you have strategic partnerships with suppliers, that's one thing. And, it's included in your SRM, your supplier relationship management processes and your strategic meetings with suppliers. But then for those smaller suppliers, it can be challenging. And, what you're trying to do there is facilitate them to get them on board. So for example, one of the approaches we take with CDP supply chain is we say, for year one, we want you to get in, have a look at the questionnaire, and here are some priority questions that Kellogg would like you to answer, rather than the full questionnaire, because it's a huge task and very daunting for a small supplier coming in at the start. So we try and work with them on that, and then as we evolve through the process, help them to improve the quality of their data, and that's where we are now. We're looking for better quality data. So it's a little bit of both, Brian. I mean, but ultimately you will have to work with these suppliers. If it's a stick, I don't think we're going to get them on board. And you're relying a little bit on policymakers and regulators as well to set a sort of a floor, to set a level to which everyone must come and in that way maybe get some of these businesses on board with this as well over time, because ultimately, you know, the standards in Europe are raising. You've seen now Europe raising its ambition potentially to 55% carbon reduction by 2030. So that will, you know, filter down again through the businesses and, you know, in terms of the regulations as well, and I think bring more businesses into scope. So there's a place for policymakers in this discussion as well, I think.
Yeah, obviously, we're not. It's interesting. We're seeing regulation almost catching up, whereas it seems to be that corporate ambition is what's driving a lot of the change at the moment. And I guess that could be a theme for a whole other webinar. Shay, I'm just going to check if there's any questions that are coming in there that you want to pass over to the panel.
Yeah. We have a question in from Jamie Corcoran, and he's just wondering about reporting of emissions for our 100% renewable electricity producer.
So reporting emissions for 100% renewable
electricity producer.
So I guess that's a scope 2 issue really in that context, right? Or are you talking about the producer themselves reporting their emissions, I wonder? It was a point that Dave, you brought up. There's a lot of focus about renewable energy, and that's critical. And I think your project, Dave, spoke to renewable energy in your supply chain. The other issue you mentioned earlier today was renewable fuels. There's a significant part of that. So again, I don't know if you've any thoughts around how do we encourage that kind of activity for companies to drive renewable fuels, because I guess as well as energy, the scope 1 issues have to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to, Brian, I know we were talking about earlier about the circular approach, and you know, there has been very much a focus on renewable electricity, and you know, there are organizations for whom their scope 2 emissions are a very significant part, but there are also organizations for whom scope 1 emissions are, you know, particularly in the food and beverage sector. I've worked in brewing, I've worked in dairy, now working in cereals, where heat demand is a massive challenge for those sectors, you know. So renewable heat, you know, where 75% of your energy usage is heat based, is based on fuels, gases, or, you know, natural gas or other things. So, and I think this is an area, particularly in the supply chain, where you can look at some circular approaches around, you know, renewable fuels like biogas, for example, being generated from food waste or from agricultural byproducts and things like that, that will hopefully resolve some of those issues. So I think that whole renewable space, there's a bit to go on that yet. I think the electricity bit is well advanced and has become quite mature, but I think on the heat side, there still is a way to go on that for businesses.
And obviously encouraging your suppliers to move to more renewable solutions drives down your scope 3 emissions in your supply chain. And something I think that Grainne touched on was obviously within that journey then, those product emissions in the circular economy. Like we saw, what was it, 50-60% of a lot of the case studies you showed. I think actually it was the Microsoft Surface, where the physical materials and the manufacturing were 75%. So I guess the role of the circular economy in keeping that carbon locked in, particularly in our supply chains. I don't know, any comment, is there anything, Ken, in terms of circular stuff, in terms of carbon that you guys are doing from a circular economy perspective?
Well, I think so. Like I said, we measure everything. So, but I think we've had you know, I suppose it is that circle, right? So product design is a huge part, and through a sustainability lens, that's really grown. So like, you know, if we look at some of our new products coming through, like Surface, you know, is it repairable within the market? That's a new thing that we're driving, so that, you know, you don't throw everything out. It's reusable, it's recyclable, it's modular, so that it can be plugged in and out with the next phase or next launch of products. Those type of activities are key in that whole circular discussion. Then you get into manufacturing, then you get into making sure that your procurement policies are correct. They're all linked in as well. You're getting to packaging distribution, which we talked about. Then you're talking about customer usage. So, you know, are we providing the next generation of products that look at customer usage? So if I take again that Surface example, our Surface Pro X, which is our newest Surface Pro X, is 28% more efficient in terms of battery life than the previous version. So you're looking at that as well, and then you kind of get into the end of life disposal and how you're managing that. And again, we map and track that very, very carefully as well. But you're doing it all. But certainly at the very start, your product design is key, because that kind of sets you up for success in one shape or fashion as well.
And I love your carbon calculator to help companies to measure the impact of using Microsoft Cloud services as well. It's very, very interesting. Shay, I'm not sure
Brian,
we answered.
we have just a couple of other questions. James Atkinson is just asking, will there be any other discussions from either Clearstream or CDP on the Global Logistics Emissions Council?
Yeah, it's a good question, because as we've got into the detail, and I think Ken acknowledged the work that GLEC is doing, there are a number of leading frameworks in that space to help companies address transportation emissions. And it's a complex system. We've air travel, sea travel, there's a lot of assets, there's a lot of investment that's already out there that's not carbon friendly. So yes, I think it's a question for us to look at the logistics section maybe as a specific item, a big issue. I think it appeared at about 10% on average from numbers we've seen. I think, Ken, in your analysis, the logistics and supply chain was a little under 10, but depending on the sector, it tends to account for that of a physical supply chain. So definitely worth the conversation. And if you have any thoughts on it, James, let us know. Shay, any other question? I'm not sure we answered Jamie's question particularly well, but we can come back to it.
Absolutely. Just a question in from Brian Gray. He's just maybe for Hugo. He's wondering what the entry-level offering from CDP on the supply chain program is.
The entry-level offering in terms of membership. Yeah, absolutely. So our kind of entry-level sort of package is, we call it corporate supply chain membership. And that would enable the member to request up to 500 of their key suppliers to disclose their environmental data through CDP. And our kind of if we want to talk kind of pricing, I'm happy to share some further details now or perhaps after the call. But essentially, the package would enable the member to request that information from those suppliers, and then we provide a kind of engagement package that sits around that, where we would hold webinars to get those suppliers to respond to some of the key questions within the CDP supply chain questionnaire. As Dave alluded to earlier, there's some kind of usually some particular aspects of the climate change questionnaire that are of a particular importance to the member, so we would hold engagement webinars to kind of emphasize those kind of aspects of the questionnaire, and bits that are kind of key to the members' supply chain strategy with regard to science-based targets, for example, as well, deforestation or water security.
So it can be. I'm not going to let Brian start. He's a great negotiator. I'm not going to let him start negotiating fees with you on the call, but we can put you in contact. But I think the interesting thing we notice is that very often companies that are now responding themselves were one time or were asked themselves at some stage by a buyer, and now they are now in turn asking their suppliers. So we're seeing that upstream, downstream, trickle down. And obviously you provide a lot of support during that process, Hugo. So I'd expect that we would see a help. We may be going to go power-wise down a little, are we? I just noticed the power thing has just dipped a little. Shay, anything else coming through?
No, we've no other questions in.
I had another question for the guys in terms of what we see as a good place to start, because once again, a lot of the companies are only starting out on this. So if you have a piece of advice, Ken, if you were looking to be a supplier to Microsoft, or you were starting out on your journey as a supplier reporting, what kind of things would you see critical to get yourself doing? Any advisory and thoughts?
Yeah, I think just getting your baseline data correct, or as accurate as you can. Like again, it doesn't, like if you're starting off, sometimes that won't be. Don't over-index on it being 100% right at the very start. What you're trying to do is get a sense of where you are and where you want to go, and then what tends to happen is you get as you get more suppliers on board, as they get more clinical in how to give you data and how you assess that data, it gets sharper and sharper. But just, I would say, if you're starting off very fresh and you're I'm talking about scope 3 in particular, just get a sense, just try and get a sense of where you are, because that's fundamental to everything. Because if you don't know where you are, you can't plan where you're going. So just get it in a rough order of magnitude, get it in some shape, and eventually then you'll start sharpening that up or using better technology to get more accurate information. Okay. That's what I would say in starting off with.
And David, your final thoughts of advice for anybody starting their journey?
Yeah, I again, very much as Ken has said, it's not about being right, perfect in terms of your data. It's about getting that understanding of where it's at, and if you're looking to reach out to suppliers to give you the scope 3 data, it's been very clear on why you're doing it. That you see them as being, critical to what you want to do with your business and in terms of your commitments, and why there's a value in it for them as well, either in continuing to be a supplier and a trusted supplier, but there are benefits to having this information, in terms of measuring their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, the energy efficiency benefits that potentially will accrue from that as well, and just getting on that journey in terms of explaining to your suppliers. And it takes time, and CDP do provide support, as Hugo said, in terms of webinars, and we've used those with our suppliers as well to familiarize them with the system, and so it's get started, and look at what others are doing. The internet's a great place. I spend not a lot of time, but I spend a reasonable amount of time looking at what the best in the sector are doing. They've put a lot of this stuff on the internet. They've put their emissions profiles information up there, and so it gives you an idea of where to start and what others are doing, which is always helpful when you're trying to form a plan.
And I know Grainne spends a lot of time working through it's a bit like looking at the past papers as a student, but looking at other responses, and it's a great source, as you say, of knowledge and information, the CDP responses from other companies, and we find lots of interesting case studies there to share. So don't be afraid to go online and look up some of those. Hugo, any parting thoughts in terms of the journey for people? I guess they can contact you if they're interested in implementing the supply chain program.
Absolutely, yeah. Really happy to discuss further with anybody that would like to. But I think, I think Ken and David have really well summarised the sort of great sort of first steps. A couple of thoughts I might add is, if you're just trying to identify which suppliers you want to start to engage with from a sort of primary data point of view, often looking at where the bulk of the spend is going is a really helpful starting point. So maybe starting with 60% to 80% of spend. Is there a subset of suppliers that you can identify that way as a starting point for engagement? And then the second thing I'd really emphasize as being key is internal engagement with the procurement team, as often, as obviously the main relationship when it comes to supplier engagement is through the procurement team, and so when it comes to the perspective of encouraging suppliers to disclose their environmental data, and giving the procurement team the tools that they need also to engage suppliers directly can also be a really effective strategy.
Excellent. That's a really good point. Tiering your partners and getting the procurement team involved as early as possible. Guys, that's been fantastic. Thank you very much. Just to go back up to our wrap up, we've reached the end of time. I think we could talk on for a long time. Actually, here we go. Screen share. Just final. Here we go. Screen 1. Am I on here? I am. Thank you. So just my last slide is a thank you slide, and essentially, are we seeing that? I believe there were some issues with yeah. Sorry, I get that. So thank you to Hugo and Alwyn, who's back at headquarters, who's been helping us in Dublin with all our responses, and is one of the reasons why we've had such an excellent response this year. So thanks, Hugo, and thanks, Alwyn, for all your support. For Dave and Ken, it's always so much better to hear from the practitioners with the scars and the practical experience. So we really appreciate you coming, putting yourself out there and sharing your experiences and advice. I'd like to thank the Dublin Chamber of Commerce and Ibec Supply Chain Network. The Dublin Chamber of Commerce have recently launched a sustainability training academy, and one of the modules is on carbon. So if you're interested in training for you or your organization, contact the Dublin Chamber of Commerce Sustainability Academy. And finally, our own team, Grainne, who did a superb job of demystifying Scope 3 emissions and in helping me when I get stressed about technology that doesn't work. Grainne, Ella, who's been helping us with the organization, Shay, Gavin, and Declan. So with greater transparency follows greater actions follow. So thank you all. Hope you enjoyed today. Keep an eye out for our next event, which will be on the 4th of November. And stay safe. And we look forward to maybe having another event on supply chain and looking at that transport issue. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.